It was Halloween weekend, and it was falling on a Saturday this year. My sister Emma and I always loved this time of year. Our mom usually went all out with the decorations, but this year she was out of town on a business trip. So it was up to us to keep the Halloween spirit alive. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knows each other, so we figured we'd still get a good number of trick-or-treaters. Since Halloween was on a Saturday, kids started trick-or-treating earlier in the day. It was a chilly, overcast day, and the weather forecast mentioned a chance of rain. I thought this might keep some kids indoors, but Emma was optimistic. She insisted we add more decorations to make our house more inviting. "Let's check the garage for any leftover decorations," she said. I wasn't too thrilled about digging through the cluttered garage, but I eventually agreed. We rummaged through boxes and found some old jack-o'-lanterns and string lights. As we were about to head back inside, Emma spotted a box tucked away in the corner. "What's that one?" she asked. "I don't know. I haven't seen it before," I replied. We pulled it out and opened it. Inside was an old, worn-out scarecrow decoration. It was life-sized, with a faded dark purple shirt and an old hat on his head. It had a face expression made out of different materials and had old, worn-out glasses. "Perfect. This will definitely draw some attention," Emma exclaimed. "I don't know, it looks kind of creepy." "That's the point, Alex, it's Halloween," she laughed. We set up the scarecrow on the front lawn, propping it up with a wooden stake. It leaned slightly to one side, giving it an even eerier appearance. Satisfied with our work, we went back inside to warm up. As the afternoon went on, a few trick-or-treaters came by, but not as many as we'd hoped. Emma was a bit disappointed. "Maybe we should have put out more decorations," she sighed. "Or maybe kids just aren't into trick-or-treating as much anymore." We spent the rest of the evening watching horror movies in the living room. Around 8 p.m., the doorbell rang. Emma jumped up, excited to hand out more candy. I followed her to the door, but when we opened it, no one was there. "That's weird," Emma said, looking around. "Probably just some kids playing ding-dong-ditch." We closed the door and went back to our movie. Not even 5 minutes passed when we heard another doorbell ring. This time I got up to check. Again, no one was there. "All right, this is getting annoying," I muttered. As I was about to close the door, I glanced toward the street. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, I thought I saw someone standing there, but it was hard to make out. "Do you see anyone?" "I thought I did, but maybe not," I replied. We decided to ignore it and went back inside. This time it was quiet for a while. About half an hour passed before Emma heard something outside. "It sounded like footsteps on the porch," she said. "What? That's probably just a wind," I reassured her. But then we both heard a soft scraping sound against the front door. Emma looked at me, her eyes wide. "Okay, that's definitely something," I admitted. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. At first I didn't see anything. Then, suddenly the peephole went dark, as if someone was covering it from the outside. I jumped back. "Someone's out there." Nervously, I peeked outside through the side window. To my horror, the scarecrow we had set up in the yard was now standing upright on our porch, completely unsupported. It didn't make sense. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of how it had moved. Emma had been inside with me the whole time, so there was no way she could have moved it. The eerie sight filled me with dread. The logical part of me wanted to believe it was just a prank, maybe some kids messing with us. But the growing unease told me otherwise. Something felt terribly wrong. Then we heard a thud from the back door, followed by the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. Someone was trying to break in. Fear gripped me, so I forced myself to dial 911. The operator assured me that officers were on their way and advised us to find somewhere safe to wait. We hurried up the stairs and went into our mom's bedroom, locking the door behind us. We stayed close together, listening to every creak and sound, hoping the police would arrive before whoever or whatever was outside got in. We could hear footsteps moving around downstairs, the floorboards creaking under the weight. "How did they get in?" Emma whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. I remembered that one of the windows in the living room didn't latch properly. Maybe they forced it open. We tried to make as little noise as possible. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps grew closer, stopping right outside the door. But just then, we heard sirens blaring outside, and the running footsteps in the house. We looked through the window and saw a scarecrow running, the same scarecrow we set up on the yard. We met 2 officers downstairs. We told everything to them, and they searched the house. The back door was wide open, and the lock had been broken. They took our statements and suggested we stay somewhere else for the night. That night, we stayed at a friend's house, but sleep didn't come easily. So many questions. One of the creepiest experiences of my teenage years happened when my friends and I were up to our usual shenanigans. Back then, we loved playing Ding Dong Ditch, where we'd ring someone's doorbell and then bolt away before they could answer. It was stupid fun, but it kept us entertained on those boring summer nights. My buddy Tom lived just a few houses down from this old, rundown place that everyone in the neighborhood avoided. The house had peeling paint, overgrown weeds, and a chain-link fence that was half fallen over. The blinds were always shut tight, and I never saw any lights on, no matter what time of day it was. One night, our friend Sam suggested we make that house our next target.
"Come on, it's perfect. Maybe we'll finally see who lives there,"
he said with a mischievous grin. I wasn't so sure.
"I don't know, guys. That place gives me the creeps."
"Don't be a wuss. It's probably just some old hermit."
Eventually, I agreed. Peer pressure, you know? So the plan was set. Tom and I would hide behind an oak tree, while Sam did the honors. The 3 of us walked down the block, trying to stifle our nervous laughter. When we got near the house, Sam took a deep breath.
"All right, here goes nothing."
Tom and I crouched behind the tree as Sam tiptoed up to the front door. We watched as he knocked the door a few times, then he sprinted back and dove behind a bush near the house instead of joining us.
"What's he doing?"
Probably wants a closer look.
We all stared at the front door, waiting for any sign of movement. But nothing happened. No lights turned on, and the door stayed shut. After a couple of minutes, Sam looked over at us and shrugged. Then, to our surprise, he went back to the door. This time, he knocked louder several times.
"He's gonna get us caught."
Doesn't seem to be. No one is living there.
As Sam started to retreat to his hiding spot again, I noticed someone move inside the house.
"Did you see that?
See what?
Someone is inside."
I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Sam was still hiding, so he didn't see someone moving.
"Sam, get back here!"
But Sam didn't hear us. He was too busy watching the house. Finally, he decided to go for the 3rd time. The front door suddenly swung open, and and he felt into the house, door closing behind him. My heart dropped. Tom and I stared in shock. We heard Sam's muffled scream from inside the house.
What do we do?
I gasped, panic rising in my throat. But before we could react, the door flew open and Sam stumbled out, letting out a scream that echoed through the quiet street.
Run!
He shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. The three of us bolted down the street, not daring to look back until we reached Tom's house. We stumbled inside, slamming the door behind us.
What the heck was that?
Someone grabbed me. It was this old guy. His grip was like iron.
Did he follow us?
I don't think so. I don't see anyone.
We all sat down in the living room trying to catch our breath. Tom's parents were already asleep, so we kept our voices low.
That was a bad idea. What if he calls the cops on us?
I don't think he will. Something about him was off.
What do you mean?
I don't know how to explain it. His eyes looked empty.
We decided it was best to lay low for the rest of the night. Tom offered for us to sleep over, and we agreed. No way was I walking home after that. A couple of hours later, after we'd calmed down a bit, we started watching random Netflix series to take our minds off the incident. Around 1 a.m., we heard a faint tapping sound coming from one of the windows.
Did you hear that?
Hear what?
Someone's at the window.
We turned off the TV and sat in silence, listening. The tapping grew louder, more insistent.
Maybe it's a tree branch?
You don't have any trees in your backyard, but good guess, Tom.
Suddenly, the tapping stopped. We let out a collective sigh of relief. But then, we heard a sound of someone walking outside of the house.
Can you check the window?
No way I am checking the window. That's it, I'm waking up my parents.
Before he could leave the room, the doorknob at the entrance started to rattle violently. Someone is trying to get in. We all froze. My mouth went dry, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears.
Whoever's out there, we're calling the police.
The rattling stopped abruptly. We waited, but there was only silence. Tom's parents must have heard the commotion because his dad came downstairs.
What's going on here?
There's someone outside that's trying to get in.
Stay here.
His dad frowned and headed towards the back door. We huddled together in the living room, too scared to move. A few minutes later, Tom's dad returned.
I didn't see anyone. However, the gate to the backyard was open. I'm calling the police.
The officers arrived within 15 minutes. We told them everything. About the ding-dong ditch, the man grabbing Sam, and the tapping at the window. They took our statements and did a sweep of the neighborhood, but didn't find anyone. They did, however, notice that the old house's front door was wide open, with no one inside. One of the officers said that it looks like the place is abandoned, but they will keep an eye on it. Feeling uneasy, we tried to get some sleep, but it was a restless night for all of us. The next day, rumors started circulating around the neighborhood. We learned from one of Tom's neighbors that the house had belonged to an elderly man who had passed away months ago. His body had been found in a river, so the house was left vacant. She showed us a newspaper article with his photo. That's when Sam started shaking.
That's him. I saw him there.
That doesn't make sense. That's impossible.
I'm pretty sure it was him. I will never forget his eyes. Those empty eyes.
Eventually, the house was torn down, and a new one was built in its place. A young family moved in, and everything seemed normal again. But sometimes when I'm walking down that street, I feel like someone's watching me from where that old house used to stand. The town where I spent my childhood wasn't the kind of place that stood out on any map. It was a quiet, forgotten place, nestled between low hills and endless fields of corn and wheat. Nothing much happened there. People lived their lives in the slow, predictable rhythms of small-town life. Work, family, church on Sundays, the kind of place where you didn't need to lock your doors because there wasn't much to fear, or so we thought. I was in my mid-20s when I met Kate. She was new to the area, having moved in to take care of her aging aunt. We clicked pretty fast after meeting at a bar that everyone around town just called The Spot. It was the only place where anything ever really happened, but even then, it was never much. After a few weeks of dating, Kate and I were spending most weekends together, trying to find ways to keep ourselves entertained in a town that seemed designed to bore the life out of you. One Sunday afternoon, we decided to take a drive. The air had that crispness that only comes in early October. And with the leaves just starting to change, it felt like the perfect way to kill a few hours. We didn't have a destination in mind, just the urge to get out and see something new. That's one thing about growing up in a rural town. You can always find a road you've never been down before. After about an hour of driving, we ended up on a road neither of us had seen before. It wasn't on any map I knew, but then again, in a town this small, that wasn't saying much. It was a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest like it had been carved out by someone with more time than sense. The trees closed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that made it feel like we were driving through a tunnel of leaves. We didn't talk much, just took in the surroundings and enjoyed the quiet. That's when Kate pointed out something up ahead. "What's that?" I squinted and saw it too. An old, weather-beaten sign just barely visible through the trees. It looked like it had been there for decades, the paint chipped and faded. The sign read, "Mason's Mill, established 1,898 inches with an arrow pointing up a gravel path that veered off the main road." Neither of us had ever heard of Mason's Mill, and we were both curious, so I turned the car down the gravel path. The road was rough, full of potholes and cracks, like it hadn't been maintained in years. After about a mile of bumping along, we reached a clearing. There, nestled between a stand of towering trees, was the mill. It was a large, crumbling building made of stone and timber, with a tall, crooked smokestack rising into the sky. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Moss and vines clung to the stone walls, and the windows were broken or boarded up. There was an old water wheel, motionless and decaying, resting in the creek that ran beside the mill. It looked like something straight out of a history book, forgotten by time. We got out of the car, the crunch of gravel under our feet the only sound. The air felt different here, colder, thicker. Kate shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. "It's kind of creepy, isn't it?" I nodded. There was something off about the place. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. Still, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a closer look. The front door of the mill was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. So we just stepped inside. The air inside the mill was damp, and the smell of rotting wood and mildew hit us immediately. The place was a wreck. Old machinery, rusted and broken, scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in graffiti, and there were signs that other people had been here at some point. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and the remnants of a fire in the corner. We wandered around for a while, poking through the debris and trying to imagine what the mill had been like when it was still in operation. But the longer we stayed, the more uneasy we both felt. It wasn't just the disrepair or the desolation of the place. There was something else, something we couldn't quite put our finger on. As we were about to leave, Kate stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" I listened, but all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees outside. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. I swear I heard footsteps." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. I tried to brush it off, telling her it was probably just the wind or the old building settling. But deep down, I felt it too. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you know you're not alone. We decided it was time to go. As we headed back toward the door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of movement in the shadows. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, rotting interior of the mill. My heart was pounding now, and I could tell Kate was just as freaked out as I was. We hurried outside, back into the clearing where the car was parked. I was reaching for the car door when Kate gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "Look." I followed her gaze to the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open space. Standing there, just barely visible in the fading light, was a figure. It was tall, dressed in old, tattered clothes, and its face was full of rage. And it was watching us. We both froze, unsure of what to do. But before we could react, without warning, he just sprinted toward us. We jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and I floored it. The car bounced and jolted down the gravel path, the tires kicking up dirt and rocks as we sped away. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the main road, the mill far behind us. "What the hell was that?" Kate finally whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We never went back to Mason's mill, and I never found out who or what that figure was. But every now and then, when I drive down that old road, I can't help but feel like it's still there, watching, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. The strangest part? I've looked for Mason's mill on maps, asked around town, but no one seems to know what I'm talking about, as if the place never existed. Or maybe, just maybe, it only appears for those who aren't supposed to find it. It's funny how memories fade, but the fear remains. I can't remember every detail of that day, but I'll never forget the way it felt, like we had crossed into a place we didn't belong.
Last summer, my parents asked me to house sit for my aunt while she traveled through Europe. She owns a big old Victorian house in the countryside, full of creaky floors, secret nooks, and antique furniture. At 18, I thought spending a couple of weeks alone in a huge house would be fun. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, with the nearest neighbor a mile away. The nearby town was quaint, but didn't offer much. I spent my days exploring the house, reading books from my aunt's library, and occasionally hiking in the woods. It was peaceful, almost too quiet at times. One afternoon, rummaging through the attic, I found a dusty old journal in a chest. It belonged to the previous owner from the early 1900s. Intrigued, I took it downstairs to read. The journal detailed the life of a man named Edward, who seemed obsessed with the surrounding woods. As I read further, Edward wrote about strange occurrences, whispers at night, shadows among the trees, and a figure he called the Watcher. It was eerie, but seemed like the ramblings of a lonely man. I shrugged it off as fiction, or perhaps the onset of madness. That evening, while making dinner, I glanced out the kitchen window and thought I saw movement among the trees. It was just a flicker, probably an animal. Still, it reminded me of Edward's journal entries. I laughed at myself for being spooked, but deep down felt that something is not right. Anyway, I went back to cooking. After dinner, I settled into the library with a cup of tea and continued reading the journal. Edward's writings became more frantic, describing how the Watcher came closer each night. He claimed to hear footsteps outside his door and tapping on the windows. As the night wore on, I heard a faint tapping sound somewhere in the house. I paused, listening intently. It was probably a branch hitting a window or the old house settling. I tried to ignore it and returned to watching TV, but the tapping persisted, irregular and faint. Feeling uneasy, I decided to call it a night. As I headed upstairs to my bedroom, I thought I heard soft footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I hurried into my room, closed the door, and locked it, a habit I hadn't felt the need to adopt until that moment. Lying in bed, I tried to convince myself that I was letting the journal get to me. It was just an old story, and my mind was playing tricks. In the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of my doorknob rattling softly, as if someone were trying to open it quietly. My heart raced as I stared at the door, moonlight casting a pale glow through the window. The rattling stopped, and silence filled the room. I got out of bed. Shaking, I went to check the door. Pressing my ear against the door, I could hear faint breathing on the other side. Summoning all my courage, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response came, but the breathing seemed to fade away as if moving down the hall. That night, the weird stuff disappeared, so I could get some sleep. The next morning, I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps I had been dreaming. Determined not to let my imagination run wild, I decided to spend the day outside. I packed a lunch and set off into the woods to explore. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush. As I ventured deeper, I found an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Curious, I approached it cautiously. The door was ajar, and inside was a mess of old furniture, leaves, and animal nests. I spotted a rickety table that had a collection of crude carvings made from wood and bone. They depicted distorted human figures and strange symbols that sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, I felt as if I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly left the cabin and hurried back toward the house. As I walked, I kept hearing rustling in the bushes behind me. I glanced back several times, but saw nothing. By the time I reached the house, I was out of breath and feeling foolish for being so scared. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the covers. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked with each step. I couldn't take it anymore. I swung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, now seeming to come from the attic above. The entrance to the attic was just down the hall. The ladder was down, and the hatch was open, a detail I hadn't noticed before. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Climbing the ladder cautiously, I poked my head into the attic. The attic was filled with boxes and old furniture. Then in the far corner, I saw a figure crouching, its back turned to me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Is this real, what I am seeing? The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. He looked like a homeless person. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the ladder. Without thinking, I bolted back to my room and locked the door behind me. I called the police with shaking hands. I tried to explain what I'd seen, though I wasn't sure they'd believe me. They arrived within the hour and searched the house and attic thoroughly. They found no one and no signs of anyone having been there. Feeling helpless, I called my parents and told them everything. They urged me to leave the house and come home immediately. I packed my things and left that night, not daring to look back at the house as I drove away. The image of that grinning figure was burned into my mind. A few days later, my aunt returned and dismissed my story as stress-induced hallucinations. She said the house had always been a bit spooky, but assured me there was nothing to fear. I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that place. As I was leaving, I stopped by the town's small library, hoping to find something that might explain the strange happenings at my aunt's house. I discovered a local legend buried in an old, tattered book. It was said that in the days leading up to Halloween, the town and its surrounding woods drew dark forces, restless spirits, shadowy figures, and something known as the Watcher. According to the legend, each year, the veil between the living and the dead thins, allowing these horrors to roam freely, especially near old homes and hidden places in the woods. The townspeople knew to avoid these areas and had long warned travelers to do the same. So I'm not sure if I believe these legends. They sound too crazy to be true. But what I am sure of is that I always check my house before going to bed, especially when Halloween is near. And sometimes when the wind rattles my windows late at night, I can almost hear a soft tapping, like a faint reminder from that dark, empty hall.
Life sometimes has a funny way of surprising you, especially when desperate times call for desperate measures. They say the night brings out a different side of the world. I should have thought about that when I decided to take this one job. A few years back, I picked up a gig as a night security guard at a storage facility on the outskirts of town. I needed the extra money to pay off some bills, so this job was the best one I could get at the time. The job seemed easy enough, mostly just walking around and making sure nobody broke into the units. But usually nights were pretty uneventful. There was rarely anything to do, and I often found myself scrolling through the internet to pass the time. However, during my second month on the job, something changed. Typically, only a few people walked through this area. It rarely attracted many visitors, especially at night. Most individuals were either at home or in the city center. However, it was the very first time I noticed this guy. He was probably in his late 30s, average height with dark hair and distinct facial lines, had this noticeable mole or mark on his cheek. He'd walk by the front gate around midnight, always wearing the same faded shirt and jeans. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walk by all the time. One night as he passed by, he glanced over and gave me a nod. I nodded back, just being polite. But then, he started showing up more frequently, almost every night. Sometimes he'd walk past, other times he'd just stand in the middle, and sometimes he'd linger near the gate, staring into the facility. It was a bit unsettling. Eventually, he approached the gate while I was on duty.
Quiet night, huh?
He said. I replied, yeah, pretty slow. He introduced himself as Dave. I told him my name was Mike. He repeated it quickly.
Mike. Very nice name, Mike.
And gave a slight grin. Something about the way he said it gave me the creeps. After that, he'd stop by almost every night for a chat. He'd ask me random questions, like how long I'd been working there, or if I ever got bored. Sometimes he'd just stand there in silence, looking past me into the rows of storage units. I started to wonder if he was scoping the place out for a possible break-in. One night, he seemed more restless than usual. He kept shifting his weight and glancing around. I initiated to ask him if everything is all right.
You ever feel like you're being watched, Mike?
He asked me with a smirk look. I didn't know how to respond, so I just shrugged it off. I decided to be proactive. So Dave, what brings you around here every night? He chuckled and said,
Just enjoying the night air. Can't a guy take a walk?
But his eyes told a different story. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He left me quite early this night comparing to other ones. Maybe he had some plans, or perhaps I triggered him somehow. Anyway, I stopped seeing him so often. Actually, a week went by without any sign of Dave, and I started to relax a bit. Maybe he found somewhere else to hang out. But then, on a rainy night, when the facility was dead quiet, something happened that I will remember for a long time. As usual, I was standing near the entrance, looking for no one to break in, when suddenly I heard footsteps near the gate. I looked up and saw Dave. Standing behind the bushes, drenched from the rain. He was staring straight at me, not saying a word. His eyes looked almost wild. "Dave, you're soaked. You all right?" I asked. He didn't respond immediately. After a few moments, he came to me, said in a low voice,
I did something I shouldn't have, Mike.
A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He stepped closer to the gate and said,
I need a place to lay low for a while, Mike.
I shook my head. "Dave, I can't let you in here. This is private property." His expression hardened, and he muttered,
I thought you might say that, Mike.
Without warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me alone. I felt uneasy, not sure what to make of the whole encounter. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That a guy who hangs around said something vague and walked off. A couple of hours later, as I was doing my routine patrol around the facility, I heard an unusual noise coming from one of the storage units. It sounded like muffled voices and faint thuds. Definitely not the typical creaks of the old building settling. I knew I was the only one on site, and no one was scheduled to access their units at this hour. I approached cautiously from the side. To my surprise, the doors were opened. My heart started pounding. I radioed in to report a possible break-in and requested immediate backup. Holding my breath, I slowly stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air inside was thick and musty, but what I saw there made my blood run cold. 2 women were inside, their wrists and ankles bound with duct tape, eyes wide with fear. They were gagged but trying desperately to speak. "It's okay, I'm here to help," I told them. But when I was about to walk to them, to remove their gags and bindings, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with Dave. His eyes widened in shock when he saw me with the women. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted out of the unit, disappearing into the night. I considered chasing after him, but decided against it. The safety of the women was my top priority. I guided them out of the unit and waited with them until the police arrived. They were shaken but unharmed, grateful to be rescued. When the officers questioned me, I described Dave in detail. One of them exchanged a knowing glance with his partner.
That's David Miller.
He said grimly.
We've been tracking him for weeks. He's wanted for multiple kidnappings and assaults.
The realization hit me hard. Dave had been using our nightly chats to gather information about the facility, most likely to hide his victims. The thought made my skin crawl. I couldn't believe I'd been casually chatting with a wanted criminal, oblivious to the danger he posed. I decided to quit the job not long after. The nights at the storage facility were no longer peaceful. They were filled with shadows and echoes that stirred up my anxiety. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found those women in time, or if Dave had decided to confront me instead of running away. Would I be still alive?